Welcome back. Picture a Sunday morning in the western Chinese city of Kashgar, sometime in the early 2000s. The sun is barely over the Pamir foothills, and already the alleyways of the old city are filling with sound. A coppersmith is hammering the rim of a wide basin into shape, the ring of metal on metal echoing off mud brick walls that have stood for 6 centuries. A boy leads a donkey cart loaded with melons through a gap in the crowd barely wide enough for its wheels. Somewhere close, someone is turning naan-dough against the hot inner walls of a clay tandoor oven, and the smell of scorched flour drifts over stalls selling dried apricots, raw wool, and hand-forged knives. A call to prayer begins to rise somewhere in the distance, unhurried, layered over the noise of commerce rather than interrupting it. This is the Sunday Bazaar, one of the oldest continuously operating markets on the old Silk Road, and on this particular morning, as on 10,000 mornings before it, nobody walking through it has any reason to think it won't be here next year or the year after that. But it will not last. Within a decade, the greater part of this neighborhood, its walls, its courtyards, its 500-year-old homes, will be gone, torn down and rebuilt so completely that longtime residents returning after years away will struggle to find the street where they were born. Over the next 20 minutes, using historic photographs, archival paintings, and careful digital reconstructions, we're going to walk through Kashgar as it stood at its fullest, before the bulldozers arrived, and then we'll stand together in the same spots as they look today. Let's step back first, to where this city's story actually begins. Long before Kashgar was a byword for Silk Road romance, it was a modest oasis town clinging to survival at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, one of the driest and most unforgiving deserts on Earth, where summer ground temperatures can climb past 50 degrees Celsius. Its lifeline was meltwater running down from the Pamir and Tian Shan mountains, channeled through a network of irrigation canals that turned a narrow strip of desert into farmland capable of supporting orchards, wheat fields, and grazing animals. Traders had been passing through this corridor for over 2,000 years, since it sat at a natural junction where routes from India, Persia, and inner China converged before splitting again toward the mountain passes into Central Asia. Caravans loaded with silk, jade, spices, and later gunpowder and paper would rest here before attempting the brutal crossing of the Pamirs to the west or the Taklamakan to the east, and the town that grew up to feed, water, and shelter them owed its very existence to that geography of exhaustion and relief. The people who settled and farmed here were a mix of Turkic, Iranian, and other Central Asian groups, herders and farmers and river valley communities that mixed and intermarried over centuries, and that blend gradually gave rise to the Uyghur identity that would come to define the city and the wider region around it. Early Kashgar was not a grand capital. It was mud walls and modest wells, a scattering of farming villages linked by footpaths, its people far more concerned with the flow of the next irrigation season than with any thought of the empires that would one day fight over their oasis. Nobody farming those early fields could have known that their small settlement would one day be called, by some, the Jerusalem of a people, a place bound up so tightly with a culture's memory of itself that its physical fabric and its identity became almost impossible to separate. By the height of its influence, roughly the 10th through the 12th centuries, Kashgar had become the capital of the Karakhanate Khanate, a Turkic Muslim state that ruled much of Central Asia and helped carry Islam deep into the Turkic-speaking world. It was here, historians believe, that the 11th century scholar Mahmud al-Kashgari compiled his monumental dictionary of Turkic languages, a sweeping work of comparative linguistics and folklore still studied today as a foundation of Turkic cultural history. The old city that grew up around this legacy was a dense weave of narrow lanes, courtyard homes built of sun-dried mud brick and poplar wood, and covered bazaars where you could buy anything from silk and jade to livestock, dried fruit, and gunpowder. Streets narrowed until 2 loaded donkeys could barely pass, then opened onto small squares shaded by mulberry trees where old men gathered to talk. The Idk Mosque, first built in the 15th century and expanded many times since, anchored the city's spiritual life. Its facade was a striking wash of pale yellow tile framed by twin minarets, and its courtyard, ringed by covered arcades, was large enough to hold worshippers by the thousands during major festivals such as Eid. None of this was static, and none of it was finished. Walls were patched every spring after winter frost cracked the mud brick. Roofs were re-laid with fresh timber, and entire blocks were rebuilt generation after generation by families who simply added a room onto an old one when they married or had children. So some houses grew organically over centuries into rambling complexes of interconnected courtyards. It was a living organism, not a preserved relic, constantly under quiet repair by its own residents right up until the very end. Civic and spiritual life in the old city were woven together in a way that would have felt completely seamless to anyone living there, with little separation between the sacred and the everyday. The Idqa Mosque served not only as a place of prayer but as a gathering point for public announcements, festival celebrations, and communal decision-making, much as a town square might function elsewhere. Nearby, the shrine complex known as the Afak Khoja Mausoleum, built around 1640 and covered in glazed green tile with a central dome and slender corner towers, honored a family of influential Sufi leaders and functioned as both a pilgrimage site and a kind of communal memory bank. Markets, too, carried a quasi-civic function well beyond buying and selling. Disputes over debts, boundaries, or marriage contracts were often aired and settled informally in the presence of respected elders right there among the stalls. The rhythms of Islamic practice, 5 daily calls to prayer, the fasting month of Ramadan, the seasonal festivals, structured the pulse of commerce and daily conversation alike, so that a shopkeeper closing his stall for afternoon prayer was simply part of the ordinary texture of a working day. Ordinary life in these streets was loud, crowded, and intensely social, layered with centuries of accumulated habit. Estimates suggest the greater Kashgar area was home to several 100,000 people by the later 20th century, with the historic Old City district alone housing tens of thousands within its dense lanes. But numbers alone don't capture what it actually felt like to walk through it. You would have smelled cumin and scorched lamb fat from skewers of kebab grilling over charcoal braziers, the sweetness of fresh melon cut open on a cart, and the mineral tang of raw wool piled high for sale. You would have heard the rhythmic clang of blacksmiths shaping horseshoes and door hinges, the creak of wooden cart wheels, and the sing-song calls of vendors advertising their prices, sidestepping bicycles, overloaded carts, and the occasional stubborn goat. Class lines were visible in the architecture itself. Wealthier merchant families built 2-story homes around private courtyards with carved wooden pillars and painted ceiling beams, while poorer families lived in single-room dwellings pressed close together along the alleys, sharing communal wells and ovens. Children ran barefoot between the stalls. Old men sat cross-legged in the shade outside tea-houses, playing games with worn dice or cards and trading gossip that had probably circulated in some form, refined and exaggerated, for generations. Graffiti here often took the form of carved names and dates on wooden doorframes and mosque pillars, small permanent signatures marking a visit, a marriage, or a prayer answered. It was crowded, occasionally chaotic, and completely, unmistakably alive. If you wanted spectacle in the old city, you went to the Sunday Bazaar, sometimes called the Sunday Market, a sprawling weekly event that for centuries drew traders from across Central Asia, from the mountain valleys of what is now Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to towns hundreds of kilometers along the Silk Road in either direction. On market day, the population of the district could swell many times over, as farmers herded in sheep, goats, and camels for sale alongside stalls of dried fruit, carpets, hardware, and hand-tooled leather saddles and boots. Livestock traders would inspect a horse's teeth and haggle for the better part of an hour over a price that might be settled, in the end, with a single handshake. It functioned as far more than a place of commerce. It was where marriages were arranged between families from different villages, where news from distant valleys arrived before anything resembling a newspaper could carry it, and where a young Uyghur trader could, in principle, build a small fortune from nothing but a cart, a good eye for quality wool, and the patience to bargain from dawn until dusk. For centuries, this weekly gathering was less a market in the narrow sense and more a recurring festival of community identity. The one day when the entire surrounding region converged in a single place. Privilege in old Kashgar looked less like a single grand palace and more like the finest courtyard homes belonging to successful merchant families and religious scholars, structures tucked discreetly behind unassuming outer walls that gave almost no hint of what lay inside. Step through the modest wooden doorway of one of these homes, and you'd find carved wooden balconies overlooking a private courtyard, painted ceiling beams in deep blues and reds, small tiled fountains, and pomegranate or mulberry trees providing shade through the hottest part of the day. These homes represented generations of accumulated wealth and status, filled with hand-woven carpets, imported porcelain, and elaborately carved wooden screens that let air circulate while preserving privacy for the women of the household. Some of the wealthiest families maintained guest rooms specifically for visiting traders and religious scholars, a form of hospitality that also reinforced social standing within the community. And yet, whatever came next for Kashgar would show little regard for that accumulated status, that careful, patient construction of family reputation across centuries. Wealth built in mud brick and carved wood, it turned out, offered no more protection from what was coming than a single-room home in the poorest alley. The turning point did not arrive as a single dramatic event, like a war or a sudden earthquake, though earthquakes were cited as part of the official justification for what followed. It arrived instead as policy, deliberate, funded, and phased. In February 2009, authorities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region formally launched a large-scale demolition and reconstruction project, backed by a budget reported at roughly $440 million, aiming to tear down and rebuild as much as 85% of the historic old city. Officials described the effort as a safety measure first and foremost, pointing to the region's genuine earthquake risk and citing a 2003 quake elsewhere in Xinjiang that had killed over 260 people and destroyed thousands of buildings, and arguing that mud brick construction, however historic, posed a real fire and structural hazard in a dense, aging neighborhood where narrow lanes could trap residents during a disaster. Over the following years, reports indicate thousands of homes were leveled in successive waves, with more than 4,700 demolished in 2009 alone and over 10,000 by the end of 2010, the demolitions proceeding block by block in a pattern observers described as almost impossible to predict. Resettlement plans reportedly aimed to relocate tens of thousands of households, a number that human rights researchers and international observers have put it close to half of Kashgar's population, into newly built apartment blocks on the city's outskirts, complete with modern plumbing, electricity, and central heating that many original homes had lacked. Many residents did receive compensation and this modern housing, and for some families the move genuinely improved daily comfort and safety. At the same time, Uyghur cultural organizations and international observers argued that the pace and scale of demolition went far beyond what earthquake safety alone would require, and that the project effectively erased an irreplaceable architectural record of Uyghur history, carried out, they said, with limited consultation of the people who had lived there for generations and, in many accounts, inadequate compensation relative to what families had lost. Both of these accounts, the government's stated safety rationale and the cultural loss described by residents and outside observers, appear in the historical record side by side, and reasonable people who have studied the events continue to weigh them differently depending on which sources and testimonies they find most credible. In the years that followed, entire blocks near the city center were reduced to rubble and open lots, with the character meaning demolish painted in red on doors and walls still awaiting the bulldozers, a grim countdown visible to anyone walking past. Families were, in some documented cases, asked to help salvage distinctive architectural features, carved door frames, decorative brickwork, painted panels, from their own homes before demolition crews arrived, elements that would later reappear as decorative facades on the newly constructed buildings replacing them. Some sections were rebuilt in a style meant to echo traditional Uyghur architecture, complete with reproduction carved woodwork and ornamental brickwork, though critics described these new structures as closer to theming for tourism than genuine restoration, a stage set built over the footprint of a demolished neighborhood rather than a continuation of it. A small protected core, including the neighborhood immediately around the Idka Mosque, was preserved and carefully restored, becoming the version of the old city that most visitors encounter today. Elsewhere, the city's original defensive walls, some reportedly standing over 10 meters high in places, had already been dismantled decades earlier, in the 1980s, and the moat that once surrounded the old city had long since been filled in and paved over to form a modern ring road, so that by the time the 2009 project began, the city's outer boundary had already lost much of its historic definition. By around 2019, according to travelers, journalists, and researchers who had tracked the changes for a decade, the large-scale demolition phase was largely finished, though isolated pockets of construction and clearing continued in certain districts. What replaced much of the original old city was a mix of wider streets designed for vehicle access, modern plumbing and wiring buried beneath new pavement, tourist-oriented shops selling carpets and souvenirs, and reconstructed buildings designed to evoke, rather than literally preserve, the neighborhood's original character. For many former residents scattered into new apartment complexes on the edges of the city, the physical anchor of family history, the courtyard their grandparents had built by hand, the alley they'd played in as children, the specific angle of light through a particular window at a particular hour, simply no longer existed in any form they could return to and touch. More recently, in a notable and, to many observers, somewhat ironic shift, regional authorities issued new regulations in 2024 calling for the protection of the old city's remaining historical appearance, its traditional courtyards, ancient trees, streets, and intangible cultural heritage, such as festivals, handicrafts, and customary practices. Some Uyghur commentators and researchers noted the difficulty of reconciling a formal preservation policy with a landscape from which most of the fabric it claimed to protect had already been cleared over the preceding 15 years. Today, researchers, photographers, and former residents, many of them now living outside China, continue working to document what survived and what was lost, through interviews, personal photo archives, and academic studies, preserving in memory and written record what could no longer be preserved in brick, timber, and carved wood. It's worth pausing here briefly on what all of this actually meant at a human scale, beneath the statistics and the competing official accounts. Every demolished courtyard was somebody's home, filled with the ordinary business of living, meals cooked over a family's own hearth, children raised underfoot, arguments settled and forgiven, prayers said in a familiar corner at a familiar hour. A city's history isn't only its oldest buildings or its most photographed monuments. It's the accumulated weight of everyday life inside them, repeated quietly across thousands of unremarkable days. When that fabric disappears all at once, what's lost isn't simply architecture, but a physical thread connecting a living community to its own past, a thread that, once cut, cannot be rewoven from new brick alone. Walk through Kashgar's old city today and the contrast is immediate and, for anyone who knew it before, genuinely disorienting. The Idqa Mosque still stands at the heart of the city, its yellow-tiled facade restored and its courtyard still filling with worshippers for Friday prayers, much as it has for centuries, one of the clearest threads of visible continuity in the entire district. The Afak Koja Mausoleum remains intact as well, its green dome and slender minarets still drawing pilgrims and tourists alike, though it is now formalized as a ticketed heritage site with a visitor center and gift shop, a shift some longtime residents have described as the site being turned from a living place of devotion into a managed attraction. Around them, though, the maze of original mud brick alleys has largely given way to widened streets lined with rebuilt shopfronts, their facades ornamented in a style meant to recall the old city while housing souvenir stalls, restaurants, and ghost houses catering to a fast-growing domestic tourism industry. The Sunday Bazaar still operates, still draws crowds, livestock, and traders from the surrounding region, though now set within a more formalized, purpose-built market structure with fixed stalls and paved lanes, rather than the sprawling, organic layout of a century ago. A handful of preserved lanes near the mosque let visitors glimpse something closer to the original texture of the place. Carved wooden doorways, painted balconies, narrow passages that open unexpectedly into quiet private courtyards. And it is here, more than anywhere else, that the old rhythm of the city can still be felt underfoot. Beyond that protected core, though most of what stands today is reconstruction rather than survival, new brick and fresh plaster shaped carefully into old forms, a city that looks, at a glance, remarkably like its former self, and yet, to those who remember walking these same streets 30 years ago, feels unmistakably different underneath. That's Kashgar, a city that has been rebuilding itself for 2,000 years, patch by patch, generation by generation, and never quite so completely or so quickly as in the last 2 decades. Thanks so much for spending this time with me and walking through its streets, old and new, together. If there's a place you'd love to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments. I read every one, and I'll see you next time.